I still remember the night I answered that Craigslist ad as if it were etched into my soul. It was a chilly October evening in a small Midwestern town, a place where old houses whispered secrets and neighbors exchanged knowing glances. I had been desperate for an affordable room, and the ad promised a quiet space in a charming historic home at a rent so low it defied common sense. I thought, sure, why not? But I soon discovered that some bargains come with prices far beyond what money can pay. From the moment I stepped inside, the house exuded an eerie ambiance. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked like groaning voices in the dark. The landlord, a gaunt man with tired eyes and a voice that dripped with a hint of melancholy, welcomed me with a curt nod. He mentioned that the house had been in his family for generations, that there were unusual happenings now and then, and that I shouldn't be alarmed if I heard things at night. At the time, I dismissed his cryptic words as the ramblings of an eccentric old man. During my first night, as I lay in the small, bare room furnished only with a cot and a single dresser, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls, painted a faded cream, seemed to breathe in the flickering light of my bedside lamp. At around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of soft weeping coming from somewhere in the hallway. I couldn't tell if it was a human cry or the wind slipping through cracks in the old structure. Heart pounding, I called out, "Hello," but received only silence in return. For days, odd occurrences grew more frequent. Items in my room would inexplicably change positions. My book left on the nightstand one morning appeared on the floor the next day. A mirror hung in the narrow hallway began to fog up, though the air was as dry as a desert. Then came the nights when I heard footsteps pacing above me, though the upstairs was locked and deserted. Every time I attempted to trace the source of these disturbances, I was met with dead ends and empty rooms, as if the presence was deliberately evading detection. One evening, driven by equal parts fear and determination, I decided to explore the attic, a place the landlord had forbidden me from entering. The narrow staircase leading up was steep and shrouded in darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight, its beam trembling as I ascended. The attic was a treasure trove of old belongings, dusty furniture, and long-forgotten relics. But what caught my eye was an old trunk, its surface scarred and its lock broken. Inside, I discovered a collection of yellowed letters and faded photographs. The letters, written in hurried, trembling script, chronicled a tragic tale of a young woman who once lived in the house. She had been accused of witchcraft, ostracized by the community, and ultimately met a violent end. The photographs depicted a gaunt, sorrowful figure with eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. As I held one of the letters, a sudden chill washed over me, and I realized that the name on the letter was my own. The landlord had been hiding a secret lineage, a bloodline cursed by the dark deeds of the past. It wasn't long after that discovery that the true terror began. One night, while I lay trying to sleep, I heard a low, raspy whisper in my ear. "Help me." The sound was so intimate, so close, that I froze, straining to see the source of the plea. My eyes darted around the dim room, and in the mirror I caught a glimpse of a spectral figure standing behind me, a woman in tattered clothing, her face contorted with anguish and despair. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear as she reached out with a translucent hand. I don't remember screaming, but the intensity of my terror broke me free of the paralysis, and I bolted from the room. The following morning, I confronted the landlord. His eyes, dark and hollow, revealed nothing of regret or sorrow as I recounted my horrifying experience. Instead, he muttered something about old debts and unfinished business. He warned me that the ghost had been tethered to the house for decades, a restless spirit caught between worlds, unable to find peace because of the sins of the past. That day, I attempted to leave the house, but every door I tried was locked, every window sealed tight as though the house itself were protecting its secrets. My phone had no signal, and the isolation was palpable, a trap laid out for the unwary. Desperation gave way to resolve as I decided to uncover the truth behind the ghost and the sinister history of the house. I began researching local records and old newspaper clippings, piecing together the tragic fate of the young woman in the photographs. It appeared that she had been a victim of a violent injustice, a scapegoat for the community's fears, punished by an enraged mob. The landlord, it turned out, was a distant relative of hers, and his family had long been haunted not only by financial ruin, but by a curse that demanded bloodshed and sorrow. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, the spirit roamed the halls, her wails echoing the injustice of her demise. As the weeks passed, the supernatural occurrences escalated. The once sporadic whispers grew into constant murmurs, repeating the desperate plea, "Help me, free me." Objects began to levitate, and shadowy figures danced just beyond the edge of my vision. One night, while trying to sleep in the dim glow of a single candle, I saw the woman materialize in the corner of the room. Unlike her previous ghostly apparitions, this time she seemed almost corporeal, mere feet away from me. Her eyes, filled with sorrow and accusation, locked onto mine. I could feel the weight of her despair pressing down on me, as if she were reliving every moment of her torment. In a voice that trembled with both rage and longing, she whispered, "You must remember. You must atone." And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of dread and a pounding headache that wouldn't subside. That night marked a turning point. I could no longer deny that something malevolent had claimed this house. I began to document every incident, scribbling notes and recording sounds on my old tape recorder, hoping that tangible evidence might help me make sense of the chaos. But the recordings were distorted, overlaid with inexplicable static and, on occasion, the faint, mournful sobbing of a woman. It was as though the ghost was using the very technology I employed to reveal its presence, a haunting reminder that no device could capture the full horror of her existence. The final straw came one stormy night when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled with matches and candles, the storm outside thrashing against the windows like vengeful hands. In the pitch-black silence, I felt a presence near the doorway. I turned slowly, and there, illuminated by a single flash of lightning, stood the landlord. But his face was not his own. It was twisted into a grotesque mask of anguish and malevolence. His eyes burned with an unholy light, and his voice was a guttural rasp as he spoke, "The past must be paid for." Before I could react, the spectral woman appeared behind him, her form merging with his in a swirling vortex of sorrow and rage. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt as if icy fingers were closing around my throat. In that moment, I knew I had to escape, even if it meant challenging the very forces that bound the house. I dashed towards the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. The door creaked open as if inviting me to leave, but every step I took was haunted by the spectral chorus of voices, each one chanting, "Atone, atone." I ran through the hallways, which seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls pulsating with ghostly energy. The labyrinthine corridors led me to the basement, a place I had always avoided, and it was there that I found the answer. In the musty darkness of the basement, I discovered an old, dust-covered journal belonging to the young woman. Its pages detailed her life, her dreams, and ultimately her horrific end at the hands of those who feared her. The final entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness and a curse laid upon her murderer and his kin. It dawned on me that the landlord and his ancestors were the instruments of that curse, and now the ghost sought to exact its revenge. The journal hinted that the only way to break the cycle was to acknowledge the past, to perform a small act of restitution, a symbolic ritual that could appease the restless spirit. With trembling hands and a heart full of both dread and determination, I recited the lines written in the journal. I made my way to the very spot in the basement where an old iron-bound chest lay hidden beneath a tattered rug. Inside, I found a few tokens: a rusted locket, a faded photograph of the woman, and a scrap of cloth embroidered with symbols I couldn't decipher. As I held these relics, I whispered words of forgiveness into the darkness, promising to honor her memory and expose the dark history that had cursed her family. The air around me seemed to shudder, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the oppressive weight of the curse lift. But even as I believed I had broken the cycle, the house seemed to breathe a final sorrowful sigh, a farewell or perhaps a warning. The landlord's apparition, now torn between torment and resignation, appeared one last time. His voice, heavy with regret, whispered, "Some debts can never truly be erased," and then he faded away into the shadows. I eventually managed to escape the house and leave that accursed town, but the memory of that night continues to haunt me. To this day, I still find myself waking up in the middle of the night, hearing faint echoes of that ghostly plea, Help me. Free me. I've learned that some secrets are best left buried, that the echoes of injustice linger long after the living have passed on. I share this story not for sympathy, but as a stark reminder. Be wary of the bargains you make, and remember that some ghosts are not content to rest quietly in the dark corners of history.
Story number 2.
I never imagined that answering a simple Craigslist ad would plunge me into a nightmare I'd spend years trying to forget. It all started on a rain-soaked evening in early November. I was desperate, recently unemployed and isolated in a city that felt increasingly suffocating. Scrolling through Craigslist, I came across an ad that promised affordable room for rent in a charming historic farmhouse. The price was shockingly low, and the description hinted at the home's storied past. But there was something in the wording that both intrigued and unnerved me. Still, with no better options on the horizon, I called the number provided. The man on the other end of the line had a gentle yet eerie calmness in his voice. He explained that the room was part of a large farmhouse on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town, a place with a reputation for its quaint charm and, according to local lore, unexplained happenings. He warned me that the house was old and might occasionally feel alive with the echoes of its past. His tone was measured, as if he were sharing a harmless ghost story. I laughed it off nervously and agreed to meet the landlord the next day. Driving down a narrow, winding road lined with barren trees, I finally arrived at the property just as dusk turned the sky a murky shade of purple. The farmhouse stood isolated, its weathered wooden exterior and sagging porch casting long, ominous shadows. I felt a prickle along the back of my neck as I stepped onto the creaking porch. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a calm, almost too friendly smile, greeted me. He wore a worn tweed jacket, and his eyes, though kind, held an inexplicable depth, as if they had seen too many things. Inside, the house was both inviting and disquieting. The living room was filled with antique furniture. Its heavy drapes muted the storm outside, and a persistent odor of aged wood and damp earth permeated the air. I was shown to my room, a modest space with a single bed, a rickety desk, and an old mirror that reflected more than just my own image. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That first night, as the wind howled outside and the old pipes groaned, I lay in bed trying to sleep. It wasn't long before I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the hallway. At first, I assumed it was the wind playing tricks, but the tapping persisted, almost as if someone was knocking, patiently waiting for a response. I called out, "Hello?" but received nothing but the sound of my own voice echoing back. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became impossible to ignore. I began to notice that objects in my room would shift positions overnight. A family photo on my desk, which I was sure I'd placed facing the wall, was found rotated toward the door in the morning. The mirror, once clear and unremarkable, would sometimes show fleeting images. A figure standing behind me, a blurred face that vanished when I turned around. I'd catch whispers in the dead of night, murmurs that seemed to float just at the edge of understanding, speaking in a language I couldn't quite place. One particularly stormy evening, after a long day of uneasy sleep and constant tension, I decided to explore the house. I needed to know more about this place that was slowly unraveling my sense of reality. The landlord had mentioned a small library where previous tenants' letters and diaries were stored. Documents, he said, would shed light on the farmhouse's long history. I found the room tucked away behind a heavy wooden door, its shelves lined with dusty journals and yellowed letters. Among these relics, one leather-bound diary immediately caught my eye. Its pages detailed the life of a young woman named Evelyn, who had lived in the house during the early 1900s. Evelyn's diary was a window into a life filled with both hope and despair. She wrote of a forbidden love, of the disapproval of her family, and of an ominous presence in the house that made her feel perpetually watched. The final entries were the most disturbing. Evelyn wrote of a terrible night when she had been visited by a shadowy figure, a presence that promised eternal torment if she dared defy its will. The diary ended abruptly with a final, hurried scrawl, "I must flee or forever be its slave." The tone was frantic, desperate. That night, as I sat in my room processing the diary's revelations, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the cold air. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but as I reached for my phone, the screen remained stubbornly dark, a dead battery despite being fully charged just an hour earlier. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing back and forth. The rhythmic thumping of a heart, both mine and something else, filled the silence. Compelled by a mix of dread and determination, I ventured out of my room, drawn by the need to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. I crept down the hall, each step resonating in the stillness, until I reached a narrow staircase that led to a lower level of the house I hadn't yet explored. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled of earth and decay. Dim light filtered through a single grimy window, barely illuminating rows of old furniture covered in white sheets. In one corner, I noticed an antique mirror similar to the one in my room, but this one was cracked and seemed to ripple, as if it were a pool of disturbed water. As I approached, a sudden sound, a low, sorrowful moan, echoed from the darkness behind me. I spun around and found myself face to face with a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, her appearance spectral and disheveled, with eyes that radiated both sadness and terror. Her once beautiful dress was tattered and stained, and her hair hung in unkempt strands around her pale face. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the silence heavy with unspoken memories. Then, in a voice that trembled with ancient grief, she said, "I never wanted this fate." Before I could ask who she was or what she meant, the lights flickered violently, plunging the basement into intermittent darkness. Each flash revealed her expression shifting, one moment pleading, the next full of wrath. I retreated, heart pounding, until I found a narrow door leading back to the main part of the house. Once inside, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify, as if the very walls were closing in around me. I bolted the door and sank to the floor, clutching the diary to my chest as if it were a talisman against the evil that had taken root here. I spent the remainder of that night in a state of constant vigilance, listening to the groans of the house and the distant, sorrowful whispers that echoed through the halls. The following morning, with the storm abated and a reluctant sun beginning to break through the clouds, I confronted the landlord. I demanded answers about Evelyn, about the strange occurrences, and about the history of the farmhouse. His calm demeanor never wavered, though his eyes darkened as he listened. In a low, measured tone, he confessed that the house was indeed burdened by a tragic past. Evelyn was not the only soul to have been tormented within those walls. Over the decades, a series of misfortunes and unexplained events had led many to believe that the farmhouse was cursed, a nexus for lost souls and restless spirits bound by a past too painful to let go. The landlord explained that his family had long been caretakers of the property, entrusted with the duty of appeasing the spirits that dwelled within. He admitted that he had tried to perform rituals and maintain certain traditions to keep the malevolence at bay, but recent years had seen a resurgence of activity that he could no longer control. His confession did little to ease my mounting terror. Instead, it deepened my understanding that I was living in a place where the past was not dead, but only dormant, waiting to exact its revenge. Desperation gnawed at me. I resolved to leave, to escape the clutches of the haunted farmhouse. But every attempt to exit the property was met with inexplicable obstacles. Doors I had used only moments before were suddenly bricked up or jammed shut. The windows, which I had counted on for escape, were sealed by layers of dust and cobwebs, as if the house itself were concealing its secrets from the outside world. My phone, still unresponsive, mocked my isolation. I was trapped, a prisoner in a house that seemed to shift and morph around me, guided by unseen forces. In the following days, the apparitions grew bolder. I began to see fleeting glimpses of figures in the mirrors, faces contorted in agony, reaching out for help. At night, I was haunted by dreams of Evelyn, of the many souls who had suffered in silence. Their voices, a cacophony of despair, filled my head, urging me to remember and to right the wrongs of the past. I found myself compelled to piece together their stories, to search the dusty journals, letters, and fragments scattered throughout the house for any clue that might offer a way out of this living nightmare. Late one night, as the clock struck an ungodly hour, I gathered every scrap of evidence I could find and returned to the basement. There, in a hidden alcove behind a stack of old crates, I discovered a small shrine, a makeshift memorial adorned with photographs, trinkets, and handwritten notes. Each token represented a soul who had once called this farmhouse home, a reminder of the sorrow and injustice that had festered within these walls. In the center of the shrine lay a single, hand-inked note. "Forgive us, and we shall find peace." With nothing left to lose, I recited the words written on that note, a simple plea for forgiveness and reconciliation. As the words left my lips, a palpable shift filled the air. The oppressive weight that had burdened the farmhouse seemed to ease, and for a fleeting moment, a gentle calm descended over the room. I could almost believe that I had, in some small way, lifted the curse. But as dawn broke and light filtered through the grimy basement window, I sensed that the reprieve was only temporary. The haunted whispers did not vanish. They merely softened into a mournful lullaby that promised further torment if I dared to forget. In the weeks that followed, I never felt entirely safe. The ghosts of the farmhouse continued their silent vigil, their sorrowful eyes following my every move. I eventually managed to escape the property under the cover of night, leaving behind the cursed walls and a past that refused to die. Even now, years later, I am plagued by memories of that time. The sound of footsteps in empty corridors, the sorrowful pleas of those who were trapped by fate, and the chilling realization that some places are marked by a history too heavy to escape. I share this account not for sympathy or to entertain idle curiosity, but as a stark reminder. The bargains you strike on a whim may come with consequences that stretch far beyond what you can imagine. And sometimes, in the search for shelter, you might just find yourself caught in the grip of a haunted legacy that will never let you go.
Story number 3.
I never imagined that a simple Craigslist ad could lead me into the heart of a nightmare. After a messy breakup and a sudden layoff, I was desperate to find a new start in a city with more opportunities and less heartache. That's when I stumbled upon the ad. Affordable room in historic Victorian apartment, unique experience guaranteed. The price was unbelievably low, and the description promised charm, history, and character. In my vulnerable state, I thought, why not? I never expected that what I was signing up for would haunt me in every possible way. I met the landlord on a gloomy, overcast afternoon in a rundown part of the city. The building was a towering Victorian relic with ornate trim, faded murals in the hallways, and a musty scent that clung to every surface. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a gaunt smile and eyes that seemed too sad for his age, welcomed me warmly. "Welcome home," he said in a voice that was soft yet unsettling. He explained that the apartment had been in his family for generations and that its history was rich and complicated. He mentioned a few strange occurrences in passing, assuring me that the odd noises and unexplained flickers of light were just part of its charm. I nodded politely, not knowing that his words were a harbinger of the terror to come. The first few nights were, at first, just disconcerting. The apartment was sparsely furnished, a simple bed, a rickety desk, and a wardrobe that creaked every time I opened it. I chalked up the creaks and groans to the building's age. But soon, the atmosphere began to change. It started with small things. A book I'd placed on the desk would later be found lying open on the floor. The picture I hung on the wall was inexplicably tilted when I returned from work. And sometimes I'd hear the soft sound of a piano playing a haunting melody from somewhere deep within the building, though I knew no one else was around. One particularly cold night, I was lying in bed, trying to drown out the persistent hum of the old heating system, when I heard a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind sneaking through a crack in the window, but the sound was too articulate, too human. "Help me," it murmured, so softly that I almost convinced myself it was a trick of my imagination. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The whisper seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows pooled in the dim light of my bedside lamp. Unable to shake my growing dread, I decided to explore the apartment. I needed to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever was lurking in the darkness. I started in the hallway, where the wallpaper was peeling like old skin, and the portraits of long-deceased tenants stared down at me with hollow eyes. The silence was thick, almost tangible, until I reached a small door at the end of the corridor. There was a faded sign above it that read "Storage." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob. Something compelled me to open it. Inside the cramped space, I discovered boxes of old letters, photographs, and trinkets from a bygone era. Among the dusty items, I found a journal with a cracked leather cover. The pages were filled with the scribbled confessions of a tenant who had lived there decades ago, a young woman named Margaret. As I read her entries, my blood ran cold. Margaret described her life in the apartment and the relentless torment she suffered from a presence that she referred to only as the Watcher. According to her writing, the Watcher was not human. It was a malevolent spirit that stalked the corridors, whispering threats and demands into the ears of its victims, feeding off their fear. Her final entry ended abruptly with a frantic scrawl, "He is coming. I can't hide anymore. Forgive me if I fail." I was now completely gripped by terror and curiosity. Who was Margaret? What happened to her? And was this Watcher still here? I took the journal with me, hoping it might offer clues that would explain the strange occurrences in the apartment. The nights grew worse after that discovery. One evening, while I was preparing dinner in the cramped kitchenette, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for several agonizing seconds. When the lights returned, I saw a reflection in the window, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the alley behind the building. I froze, the knife I held slipping from my trembling fingers. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then came the night of the full moon. I had barely slept, plagued by nightmares of endless corridors and unseen eyes. At around 3 a.m., I awoke to a soft, echoing tapping at my door. Heart hammering, I got out of bed and crept to the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the inky blackness of the hallway. When I opened the door just a crack, I saw a flash of movement, a dark silhouette slipping away down the hall. I followed it, my pulse racing, and found myself in a corridor I'd never noticed before. The walls here were different, adorned with faded wallpaper and intricate molding that told of a time when the building was something grander. In the distance, I heard the sound of soft crying. I moved toward the sound, and as I did, the temperature dropped precipitously, and my breath became visible. At the end of the corridor, I came upon a closed door. The crying was louder now, muffled by the thick wood. I hesitated, then slowly pushed it open. Inside was a small, dusty parlor that looked as if it hadn't been used in decades. In the center of the room stood an antique rocking chair, swaying ever so slightly as if someone had just vacated it. And there, in the reflection of an old, cracked mirror hanging on the wall, I saw her, a translucent figure of a woman with sorrowful eyes and hair that floated around her face like a shroud. She did not move or speak, but her eyes met mine with a pleading that shattered my resolve. The sight was so heart-wrenching and full of despair that I couldn't tear my gaze away. I tried to speak, to ask who she was and what she wanted, but no sound came from my lips. Instead, the mirror slowly morphed, and in its depths I saw fragments of Margaret's journal, pages filled with terror and regret. The apparition's presence overwhelmed me, and I staggered back, nearly colliding with the doorway. As I fled the parlor, the soft sound of her whisper, "Please, help me," followed me, echoing down the corridor long after I had shut the door behind me. I decided then that I could not remain a prisoner in this cursed apartment any longer. I confronted the landlord the following morning, armed with the journal and trembling with a mix of fear and determination. In his cluttered, dimly lit office, I demanded to know the truth about Margaret, the Watcher, and the strange happenings that had tormented me for days. His eyes clouded with a sorrow that matched the darkness in the apartment as he spoke in a hushed tone. "This building," he explained, "has a long history of sorrow and regret. Margaret was one of many who suffered here. The Watcher is a remnant of the past, a spirit that was bound to this place by betrayal and heartbreak. It feeds on the anguish of those who dwell within these walls, and no matter how many attempts we make, it is never truly gone." He went on to say that the only way to appease the restless spirit was to confront the sins of the past, to acknowledge the tragedies that had occurred here, and perhaps, in doing so, allow the ghosts of those lost souls to finally rest. I wasn't sure I believed him, but deep down, I knew that if I didn't try to break the cycle, I would be trapped in perpetual terror. That very night, I gathered every scrap of evidence I could. Margaret's journal, old letters, and photographs I found scattered throughout the apartment, and set out to piece together the puzzle. I spent hours poring over documents in the building's neglected archive room, discovering accounts of other tenants who had vanished or been driven to madness by the malevolent presence. The more I learned, the more I realized that the apartment was not just haunted by a single spirit, but by a collective sorrow, a tapestry of broken lives stitched together by tragedy. Determined to end the cycle, I followed a ritual described in one of the faded letters. It required me to stand in the center of the main hall at midnight, recite words of absolution, and offer a personal confession for any past wrongs committed in the name of neglect or indifference. With shaking hands and a voice that barely rose above a whisper, I recited the incantation, my eyes fixed on the shadows dancing on the walls. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange energy, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the watcher's eyes glimmer with recognition. But as soon as the ritual ended, the building shuddered as if in pain. The lights flickered, and the walls seemed to moan with an ancient grief. I felt as though I had opened a door that could never be closed, unleashing the full weight of the apartment's tortured history. I ran back to my room, terrified that the spirit's wrath might be unleashed upon me. The nights that followed were a blur of terror and regret. The Watcher's manifestations grew more violent. Doors slammed shut on their own, mirrors shattered without explanation, and ghostly figures appeared in every reflective surface. I began to doubt whether I had truly succeeded in appeasing the restless souls, or if I had merely angered them further by dredging up the past. Every night as I lay in bed, I could hear the echoing footsteps in the corridors and the desperate pleas of a woman who had long since lost hope. Eventually, I knew I had to leave. I packed my belongings in the dead of night, careful not to disturb the malevolent energy that still pulsed through the building's veins. As I stepped out into the cold, pre-dawn air, I glanced back at the looming structure. In one of the upper windows, I saw the faint outline of a woman, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to pierce through the darkness, and the shadow of a tall, brooding figure standing behind her. In that moment, I understood that some spirits, no matter how deeply buried by time and neglect, never truly let go. I left the city that night, vowing never to return. Even now, as I try to rebuild my life far away from that accursed place, I am haunted by memories of that Victorian apartment and the sorrowful whispers of its ghosts. I share my story as a warning. Be cautious of the bargains you make in desperate times. Some deals come with a price far beyond what you might ever be prepared to pay, and some ghosts are doomed to roam, forever binding the living to a past they cannot escape.
Story number 4.
I still shudder when I recall the Craigslist ad that promised a cozy, affordable room in a historic downtown loft. Must see. I was at a low point. New in town after a messy divorce and struggling to find my footing in a city whose lights now seemed to mock my loneliness. The ad's promise of charm and character spoke to me. I imagined the kind of quirky space where I could start over. What I didn't imagine was that this room would introduce me to a past that refused to rest. The loft was in an old brick building nestled in a part of town that had more stories than residents. When I first arrived, the building's faded facade and wrought iron details hinted at its once grand past. I met the landlord, Mr. Dunbar, a quiet man with a lined face and a distant look in his eyes. His welcome was polite but unsettling. He warned me in a low voice that the building had a lively history and that the room I was renting was unique in more ways than one. I chalked it up to local lore. After all, every historic building had its ghost stories, didn't it? My room was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in a narrow corridor lined with heavy, worn doors. The space was small, a single room with a modest bed, a desk, and a large window overlooking the darkened alley below. The furnishings were sparse but tasteful, relics of another era that lent the room an eerie elegance. I spent the first day unpacking, trying to settle into a space that already felt as if it were holding its breath. That first night, the silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard a soft tapping at the window. I dismissed it as branches scraping against the glass in the breeze. But then I noticed that the tapping wasn't random. It came in a deliberate, rhythmic pattern, almost like someone was trying to send a message. I tried to sleep, convincing myself it was nothing more than a trick of the wind and my own anxious mind. In the following days, subtle disturbances began to pile up. At first, it was minor things. The wardrobe door would creak open when I wasn't looking, and I'd find my notebook moved from the desk to the nightstand with no explanation. I even caught a glimpse of a pale face in the mirror behind the door, a face that vanished the moment I turned around. I'd brush it off as exhaustion, but a growing dread settled in the pit of my stomach. One evening, as a cold rain battered the city and the building creaked under the storm's weight, I returned home late from work. I noticed that the hallway lights were dimmer than usual, casting long, eerie shadows that made the familiar corridor seem like a labyrinth. My footsteps echoed as I passed by a door left ajar that I was sure I'd locked. When I reached my room, I found the window slightly open, though I distinctly remembered closing it before I left. There was no sign of forced entry. Instead, it felt as if someone had silently slipped inside, leaving behind only a cold draft and an unshakable feeling of being watched. That night, sleep eluded me. The room was uncharacteristically noisy. The old pipes groaned as if in pain, and the building seemed to whisper secrets through the cracks in the walls. As I lay awake, I began to notice something impossible, a quiet, almost imperceptible hum that resonated from the walls themselves. It grew steadily louder until it melded with a soft, sorrowful melody. It wasn't music I recognized, but it stirred a deep, inexplicable sadness within me. In the following days, I became obsessed with uncovering the history of the building. I visited the local library and combed through old newspapers and property records. I learned that the building had been constructed in the early 1900s and had once been the residence of a prominent family whose fortunes had mysteriously crumbled. There were rumors of tragedy. A young woman named Lillian who had lived in the building, whose life was cut short under suspicious circumstances. The whispers of her name seemed to linger in the faded records, always accompanied by mentions of grief and unanswered questions. Her portrait, though never officially displayed, was said to be hidden somewhere in the building, her eyes perpetually mourning the loss of a life never fully lived. The pieces began to fit together when I found an old, leather-bound journal wedged behind a loose brick in the hallway. It was fragile with age, its pages yellowed and edges curled. The entries were written in a delicate hand, detailing Lillian's quiet despair, her sense of isolation, and the oppressive feeling that she was never alone in the building. In one entry, she described a presence, a cold, spectral figure that hovered at the edge of her vision, watching her every move. Her last entry was a hurried scrawl, a desperate plea for forgiveness and release from a fate she couldn't escape. That night, armed with the journal and a mix of fear and determination, I resolved to confront whatever haunted my room. I placed the journal on my desk and sat in the dim light, reading Lillian's words over and over. As I read, the room grew colder, and the quiet hum from the walls deepened into something like a whisper. I looked up, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a figure in the mirror, a woman in a faded dress, her eyes brimming with sorrow. Her presence was almost tangible, and for a heartbeat, I felt as if our souls were locked in silent conversation. Then she vanished, leaving me trembling in the stillness. The next day, I confronted Mr. Dunbar. I found him in his cramped office on the first floor, surrounded by dusty ledgers and old photographs of the building's past residents. His eyes were downcast as I recounted what I had experienced, how I felt watched, how the journal revealed Lillian's torment, and how the room itself seemed to mourn her memory. He sighed, a sound heavy with regret, and admitted that Lillian's spirit was said to linger in the building, bound by the tragedy of her untimely death and the secrets that had swallowed her whole. He confessed that he too had witnessed inexplicable occurrences over the years, but had always hoped that by acknowledging the past, the hauntings might eventually cease. He warned me that the spirit of Lillian was not malevolent in the traditional sense. She was a sorrowful ghost, forever trapped between worlds, desperate for acknowledgement and forgiveness. Some things, he said quietly, cannot be undone, and some losses are too profound to let go. His words chilled me further than any ghostly encounter ever could. That evening, with a heavy heart, I decided to try a small act of reconciliation. I gathered the journal, a few personal mementos I had found in my room, an old photograph of a smiling family, a tarnished locket, and placed them in a small box. I returned to the room and, facing the window that overlooked the dark alley, I spoke softly into the quiet. I apologized on behalf of the living for the neglect of the past, for the secrets that had festered in these walls. I recited the words from Lillian's final entry, my voice trembling as I hoped to bring her the peace she so desperately sought. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped sharply, and the hum from the walls swelled into a mournful cry that seemed to envelop the entire room. I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder, as if someone were trying to comfort me, and in that touch, I sensed an overwhelming sadness, a lifetime of grief distilled into a single, aching presence. I dared not move, afraid that any sudden motion might break the fragile communion that was unfolding. The following morning, the atmosphere in the room was inexplicably lighter, though I knew the spirit's pain was far from healed. I left the building later that day, my mind swirling with both relief and melancholy. I moved on, eventually finding another place to live in a quieter neighborhood, but I never forgot what had transpired in that haunted loft. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a reminder that some pasts are inescapable, and that the sorrow of those who have been forgotten can reach across time to touch our lives. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees, I swear I can still hear a soft, plaintive melody, as if Lillian's spirit were singing her sorrow to the stars. And though I have since rebuilt my life and left that old building behind, I carry with me the weight of a story that is not entirely my own, a story of loss, regret, and the lingering echoes of a life cut short.
Story number 5.
I still remember the day I clicked on that Craigslist ad. It seemed like the answer to my mounting financial woes. The ad read, "Room for rent in a quaint colonial home, must see." It promised low rent and a warm, homey environment in a small New England town. I was skeptical at first, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Little did I know that click would open the door to a nightmare I still struggle to escape. I arrived at the address on a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the leaves crunch underfoot and the sky hangs heavy with the threat of rain. The house stood alone on a quiet street, its white clapboard exterior and green shutters worn by time. The vibe was nostalgic, a relic from a bygone era. As I approached, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves mingled with something indefinably old, as if the house itself exhaled memories. The landlord, Mr. Hawkins, greeted me at the door. He was an older man with a lined face and eyes that held a secret sadness. "Welcome," he said softly, as though he were confiding in me a cherished secret. "I've kept this home in the family for generations. It's a lovely place, if you don't mind a few peculiarities." I assumed he was referring to the creaks and groans common to an old house. With a tight smile, I agreed to sign the lease. The room I rented was on the second floor, a modest space with bare white walls and a single window that looked out over the overgrown garden. The decor was minimal, a wooden bed frame, a rickety desk, and an old wardrobe that seemed to whisper when opened. Despite my initial unease, I found solace in the low rent and the promise of a fresh start. That very night, I lay in bed listening to the steady drumming of rain on the window pane. At first, it was calming, a lullaby that accompanied my drifting into sleep. But as midnight passed, I began to sense that I wasn't alone. I'd first noticed a faint, almost imperceptible tapping coming from the wardrobe. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than the wind, but deep down, a chill crawled along my spine. The next morning, I dismissed my fears as the residue of a restless night. I made coffee in the cramped kitchens, its linoleum floor slick with spilled water from a leaky tap. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard hushed whispers coming from the living room. I walked over and found Mr. Hawkins seated in an armchair, staring out the window. His gaze was distant, and he didn't immediately notice me. Good morning," I ventured. He turned slowly, and his eyes, red-rimmed and sorrowful, met mine. "Good morning," he replied, his voice heavy. "I see you've settled in. There's something I need to tell you about this house." I listened intently as he explained that the home had a troubled past. "Many years ago," he began, "there was a terrible incident in the basement. A young woman, Emily, lived here, and she met an untimely and tragic end. They say her spirit never left." I felt a knot in my stomach, but Mr. Hawkins continued, "I try not to dwell on the past, but she has been seen wandering these halls, mourning and sometimes angry. You might hear her cries when the wind is just right." I couldn't shake his words. That night, I lay awake listening to the rhythmic creaking of the old house. Just as I was about to drift off, a soft sobbing reached my ears, a sorrowful sound coming from somewhere below. My heart pounded as I tried to pinpoint the source, but the darkness of the room swallowed every detail. I kept thinking about Emily, the tragic soul condemned to haunt the place. The following days brought more strange occurrences. I'd come home from work to find small items moved, a book placed where I was sure I'd left it, a pair of shoes reoriented on the rack. Once, while reading in my room, I looked up to see the wardrobe door slightly ajar, even though I had closed it meticulously. Each unexplained detail gnawed at my nerves, building up a palpable tension that I couldn't escape. Late one stormy evening, the house was plunged into darkness when a fierce wind snapped the power. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam shaky in my anxious hand. As I made my way down the narrow, creaking staircase, I heard the soft sound of footsteps following me. I spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing but flickering shadows. At the bottom of the stairs in the entrance hall, the air felt colder than before. In the mirror hanging on the wall, I caught a glimpse of a woman's reflection, a pale figure in a flowing dress with tear-streaked cheeks. I blinked, and she was gone. Determined to get to the bottom of these happenings, I began to explore the house more thoroughly. One rainy afternoon, I ventured into the basement, a place Mr. Hawkins had warned me to avoid. The basement door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow, dim corridor lined with cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past. In one dusty corner, I discovered an old photograph album. Flipping through its brittle pages, I saw pictures of a smiling woman in Victorian attire. On the back of one photo was inscribed the name Emily Hawkins. I froze. The realization was chilling. Emily wasn't just a tragic tale from long ago. She was a member of this family. My pulse raced as I rifled through more documents, finding a faded newspaper clipping about a mysterious death. It detailed how a young woman, rumored to have been engaged to a local man, was found lifeless in the basement under circumstances that were never fully explained. Her death had cast a long shadow over the Hawkins family, and it seemed her spirit was restless, burdened with grief and injustice. That night, I resolved to confront the ghost of Emily. With the photograph and newspaper clipping in hand, I sat in my room and tried to recall every detail Mr. Hawkins had shared. As the clock ticked past midnight, the familiar chill returned. The soft sobbing began again, this time louder and more insistent. I mustered my courage, and in a trembling voice, I said, "Emily, I know your story. I'm sorry for what happened. I want to help you find peace." For a moment, there was silence, a heavy, expectant pause. Then the room filled with a gust of icy wind, and the faint outline of a woman appeared at the foot of my bed. Her face was a sorrowful mask, eyes pleading and filled with a depth of despair that cut through the darkness. "Help me," she whispered, the sound barely audible but echoing with raw anguish. I felt as if her plea reverberated in every corner of the room, a cry for justice and release. In the days that followed, my nightly encounters with Emily grew more vivid. I started recording my experiences, hoping to capture some evidence of her presence. The recordings, however, were marred by static and broken whispers, snatches of words that I could only partially decipher: betrayal, forgiven, set free. I pieced together that Emily's spirit was tied to unresolved grief, a legacy of betrayal and heartbreak that had condemned her to wander the halls of her former home. Desperate for answers, I approached Mr. Hawkins once more. In his quiet, gravelly voice, he admitted that the family had long harbored a dark secret. Emily was betrayed by someone very close to her, he confided. Her lover, it is said, was responsible for her untimely death, and the shame and guilt that followed stained our family for decades. I've tried to make amends in my own way, but some wounds run too deep. His eyes, dark and haunted, met mine as he continued. If you wish to help her, you must bring the truth to light. Only by acknowledging the betrayal and offering forgiveness can her soul be released. Armed with this new knowledge, I began to delve into the history of the Hawkins family, poring over old letters, diaries, and even legal documents that had long been hidden away in the attic. I discovered that Emily's death had been covered up, a scandal buried beneath layers of silence and shame. I learned that her lover had been a prominent member of the community, and that his influence had ensured that the truth was never fully revealed. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. One particularly dark night, Determined to break the cycle of sorrow, I gathered the evidence I'd amassed. I set up a small memorial in my room, a makeshift altar with Emily's photograph, the newspaper clipping, and a few tokens I'd found among the family heirlooms, a delicate handkerchief embroidered with her initials and a faded locket. With a quivering voice, I recited words of apology and absolution, speaking directly to her spirit. Emily, I know what happened. I know you were betrayed and left alone in your grief. I forgive those who wronged you, and I beg you to forgive us for not knowing, for not speaking out. Let your soul be free. As I finished, a profound stillness fell over the room. The oppressive chill receded, replaced by a warmth that I couldn't quite explain. In that moment, I thought I saw Emily's form soften, a glimpse of peace in her sorrowful eyes. The next morning, I found that the air in the house felt lighter, as though a long-held burden had been lifted. Yet, even with that moment of apparent release, the house and its memories continued to haunt me. I eventually decided to move out, unable to fully shake the lingering energy of the place. As I packed my belongings, I took one last look at the old colonial home, its white exterior now seeming more like a monument to lost lives than a place of refuge. Mr. Hawkins, standing quietly on the porch, offered a solemn nod, a silent acknowledgement of the past and perhaps of a debt partially repaid. Even now, many years later, I still feel a subtle tug when I recall that room, that basement, and the ghost of Emily, who once cried out for help in the dark. I share this story not merely as a cautionary tale about Craigslist bargains or haunted houses, but as a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, can reach out and touch us in the most unexpected ways. Some secrets demand to be remembered, and some souls can only find rest when their story is finally told.
Story number 6.
I'll never forget the night I answered that Craigslist ad. I was at my wit's end. Jobs had dried up, and my savings were nearly gone. In a desperate bid for a fresh start, I scrolled through Craigslist and found an ad that promised a rustic cabin retreat in the Ozarks. Low rent, total privacy. The ad painted a picture of solitude, nature, and escape from the chaos of modern life. I was skeptical at first, but with nothing left to lose, I called the number. The voice on the other end was soft, with an unmistakable rural drawl. He explained that the cabin was on the outskirts of a small town in the Ozarks, nestled deep in the woods and far from prying eyes. The rent was shockingly low, and he assured me that the isolation was exactly what I needed to rebuild my life. I didn't ask too many questions at the time. Desperation tends to dull the senses. I signed the lease over the phone and arranged to pick up the keys the following afternoon. Driving along the winding roads leading to the cabin, I was struck by the eerie beauty of the landscape. Tall pines and gnarled oaks formed a dense canopy overhead, and the sun dipped low behind the ridges, casting long shadows over the narrow path. When I finally pulled up to the property, I was both enchanted and unsettled. The cabin itself was a weathered wooden structure with a sagging porch and a rusted metal roof. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades, yet a faint light glowed from one of the windows. I stepped up to the door and was greeted by the landlord, Mr. Parker, a thin, solemn man with deep-set eyes. He wore a battered cap and had calloused hands that hinted at a lifetime of hard work. "Welcome," he said in a low voice. "I hope you find peace here. The woods can be forgiving, but they also hold secrets." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a smile and accepted the keys without further comment. The interior of the cabin was sparse. An old sofa with threadbare fabric, a small wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. There was no modern convenience here. Even a clock on the wall was an antique relic, its hands frozen at 3:17. Despite its rustic charm, the cabin exuded a strange melancholy, as if it were mourning lost time and forgotten souls. That very first night, I tried to settle in. I lit the stove and let the flickering flames chase away the darkness, but as midnight crept in, a sense of foreboding began to build. I lay in bed listening to the silence when I first heard it, a soft, persistent tapping coming from outside the window. At first, I thought it was a branch scratching against the glass, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I lay frozen, straining to hear if it might be the wind. Instead, I heard whispers, low and indistinct, mingling with the sound of the rain that had started to fall in a steady drizzle. The next morning, I ventured outside to clear my head. The rain had left the forest washed clean, but a heavy fog lingered among the trees. I wandered around the cabin's perimeter, trying to get a sense of the property. That's when I noticed something odd near a clump of bushes, a small, old tin box, half buried in mud. Curious, I pried it open with my pocket knife. Inside was a collection of faded photographs, a tattered journal, and a couple of rusted trinkets. The photographs were of the cabin taken long ago, and one image in particular caught my eye. A family gathered in front of the very same cabin, their faces solemn and distant. The journal's pages were yellowed, the handwriting spidery and erratic. I flipped through it and discovered entries describing strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and a deep, abiding sorrow. One entry ended abruptly with a single, blood-stained word: betrayed. Unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. That evening, determined to learn more about the cabin's past, I sat by the stove with a journal and tried to piece together the mystery. The entries spoke of a time when the cabin was home to a close-knit family who lived off the land. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted to one of terror. The writer described something lurking in the woods, a presence that crept into the cabin at night, watching, waiting. There were hints of betrayal and loss, as if one of the family had done something unforgivable, unleashing a curse upon them all. The final entries were the most disturbing, recounting a night when the entire family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only blood and shattered dreams. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I sat in the living area, the journal spread open on my lap, when I heard the soft tapping again, this time coming from beneath the floorboards. My heart hammered in my chest as I rose and followed the sound to a loose floorboard in the center of the cabin. With trembling fingers, I pried it up, revealing a dark, narrow space below. Descending into the cramped crawl space with only the beam of my flashlight to guide me, I found remnants of what appeared to be old furniture, discarded toys, and, horrifyingly, a single broken locket. The locket was engraved with initials that matched one of the names in the journal. I felt a cold dread wash over me as if I disturbed something that should have remained buried. In the following days, the cabin's disturbances escalated. At night, the sound of footsteps echoed in the narrow hallways, and the temperature would drop so low that I could see my breath. I began to see fleeting shadows dart across the walls and hear soft weeping in the distance. Once, as I sat by the window watching the fog roll in, I thought I saw a pale face looking back at me, a face that vanished when I blinked. I confided in Mr. Parker when I next saw him, and he only sighed, his eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't decipher. "The woods remember," he murmured cryptically, "and some souls are trapped between what was and what might have been." Desperation and fear mounted. I spent countless sleepless nights poring over the journal, desperate to understand what had happened. I pieced together a tragic tale of infidelity, betrayal, and a family torn apart by guilt. The entries hinted that the spirit haunting the cabin was not simply malevolent, it was tormented, forever bound to a moment of anguish. The broken locket, the whispered pleas in the dark, the relentless tapping, it was all connected to a bitter betrayal that had sealed the family's fate. One stormy evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance and lightning illuminated the darkened sky, I decided to confront the presence. I gathered the journal and the locket, and I stepped into the living room where the air was thick with an unspoken tension. "I know your story," I said, my voice quivering with both fear and compassion. "I know you were hurt, and I'm sorry. Please, let me help you find peace." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, as if stirred by my words, the temperature plummeted. I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure on my chest and saw the faint outline of a woman standing in the doorway, a spectral figure with sorrowful eyes and a presence that radiated both longing and despair. She did not speak, but in that silent moment, I felt her anguish, her pain from a betrayal long past. In a whisper that mingled with the storm's howl, a voice, soft and tremulous, spoke the words, "Forgive me." I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, and repeated the promise of forgiveness, not just for her, but for all the souls trapped in the echo of that terrible night. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift ever so slightly, as if my words had opened a door to long-suppressed memories. For the first time since I'd arrived, the ghostly manifestations eased, and the relentless tapping subsided into a mournful lullaby. Yet, even as the immediate terror receded, I knew the cabin's wounds would take time to heal. I spent the next few days carefully restoring small items I had found to the crawl space and leaving offerings near the old tin box, tokens of remembrance and apology. Eventually, I made the difficult decision to leave the cabin behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that while I might have offered a measure of solace to the restless spirit, the burden of that past would forever linger in the woods. As I drove away along the narrow, winding road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, amid the shifting trees and fading fog, I thought I saw a gentle face watching from the edge of the forest. A silent guardian, or perhaps a soul finally given a chance to find peace. I share this story not as a ghost tale to thrill or terrify for amusement, but as a solemn reminder that sometimes the past clings to the present with a grip that can chill you to the bone. When desperation leads you to answers in the unlikeliest of places, like a Craigslist ad for a secluded cabin, be prepared for the secrets that may awaken. Some bargains come with a cost that echoes through time, and some souls may need our compassion to finally let go.